According to leaked documents, the Russian armed forces have lost in 2025 alone enough men to fill 140 brigades. We'll talk about this as well as about anything else that is happening along the front lines and behind them in this SITREP about the war in Ukraine. The Ukrainians have struck the Ivasivska rail yard on the Crimean Peninsula. They hit the Sverdlov explosives factory, the Tuapse refinery, the Kirshi refinery, the Tyumen refinery, 2,000 kilometers away from Ukraine. The Ukrainians also hit a cooling tower of the Novovoronezh nuclear power plant, but according to the Russians themselves, we have here Rosenergoatom, they are saying that it was suppressed by technical means, meaning that the drone was prior to that intercepted with electronic warfare and thus clearly not aimed at that at the nuclear power plant. The Russians on their side struck Ukrainian targets again, like they do every night. In the night to the 7th of October, 2 ballistic missiles and 152 Shahed drones were used. Only 88 of the drones were intercepted, and 2 ballistic missiles as well as 52 drones hit 10 targets. The targets were civilian and energy infrastructure. Among the targets was also a maternity hospital that was struck with a Shahed over these past days. This once again shows that the Russians have started to concentrate their attacks on a smaller number of targets, and there they are able to oversaturate and thus achieve higher hit ratios. We'll switch to the developments along the front line, and here we have the deep state map saying us that the Russians have advanced in the direction of Sumy. The deep state map gives the area around Novomykolaiv to the Russian side, more or less this area here. And we have a geolocation from Yunakivka. Here we have Ukrainian soldiers operating and trying to take prisoners, which are then killed by the Russians themselves with a drone drop. This happened in the area here in the center. So we see that the Ukrainians are still operating in the southern part of Yunakivka. A Russian mill blogger from the area is also writing that the Russians have significant resupply issues there and are, among other things, dependent on rainwater because they do not get enough water from their supply system as Ukrainian drones cut the lines of supplies. That was it from the Sumy region. In Kharkiv, we have nothing in Vovchansk, but we have a change here in this area. We have the Russians in the northern part of Odratne. This is geolocated here at this point. Where they came from exactly is unclear. So whether they crossed over here, that seems to be the most likely, or whether they came from the west or from the south, both is theoretically possible, but the most likely is that they crossed over the border and thus reached the town of Odratne. On the eastern front, we have the Russians in Kamyanka here also advancing. We have them a little bit further north in the town of Kamyanka. On the map, that's more or less at this point here. The Russians also advanced or have shown in fresh positions in Kupiansk. We see the deep state map now saying everything until the road here is contested area. And in this, we have a geolocation here where the Russians have recently been spotted roughly at this point here in the south, indicating that the Russian advance in Kupiansk is slowly grinding forward. Further to the east, the Russians have advanced close to Stepova Novoselivka. We have that here. Geolocated positions are at this point here, and at this point we can see the 2 lakes here as a good indicator of the positions. And let me quickly see again. So this is Stepova. We have it here and here. Should be here in this direction and here down here. Fresh Russian positions, this again inside of the contested area. The Ukrainians are saying that Russia's Rubicon drone unit is much more active now around Kupiansk and is obviously causing serious problems. They are doing remote mining as well as FPV drone strikes against the Ukrainian logistics, which is complicating the situation in this area. That was it from the area north of the Seversky Donetsk. South of the Seversky Donetsk, we have the Russians advancing southeast of Seversk. This is not a major change in regards to what we previously had, but it's roughly at this point, it's roughly only like 200 meters further than we had recently, but it shows us that the Russians are getting closer towards the Seversk here. At Vimka, we also have the Russians in a new position here along the railroad line. Roughly at this point, we recently had them inside of Vimka, so probably this area is more or less in the contested area as of now. Further to the southwest, the Russians have shown to be in the town of Kuzminivka. We have that at this point here, where they are in center of town. Whether they manage to consolidate or not is unclear, but we see that the Russians are advancing in the northern direction. Recently, we saw them in Fedorivka, seemingly having taken the town. So the pressure from Seversk is coming from the south, southeast, east, and from the north as well. Seversk is ever more under pressure. In the direction of Kostiantynivka, the Russians have entered the town of Predtechune. This is here. We have them to the western side of Predtechune. So they are already at this point here further west than Stupochki, now closing in on Kostiantynivka from the east as well. And we have the Russians in Ivano-Pilia, where a Russian soldier was struck with a Ukrainian FPV drone while entering a position. This is here also again showing that the line of supply towards the area south of the reservoir is maybe not cut yet, but definitely not far away from being cut, as the Russians are now operating in this area here as well. In the direction of Pokrovsk, we have the Russians in the town of Pankivak, or close to Pankivak. Let me quickly check. We have that here. Pankivka. This is here. And the Russians were struck at this point here, indicating that this is no longer under solid Ukrainian control. This whole area is contested. Both sides operate in between. The Russians to resupply and reconnect with their pockets further north, and the Ukrainians are operating in the area in between to cut it, but it seems likely that there are not really permanent positions between those two areas. According to Ukrainians, the Russians also tried a bigger mechanized assault in this direction when the weather was bad, indicating the Russians do still think about mechanized advances, but they see that with good weather and with the ability to operate drones, it has no point. But if they think they can get away with it, they do still try it. So this is something that might happen in bad weather in winter, that we see bigger mechanized advances coming again. Then we have the Ukrainian analyst Konstantin Mashovets. He said several things about the Pokrovsk area here. He says that Novoekonomichne is fully under Russian control. He also said they occupied the mine to the west of it, and he said Krasny Liman is also taken by the Russians. So if we take his words, and he's pro-Ukrainian, a former Ukrainian officer, then probably the area of Russian control should be considered more or less like this by now, getting closer and closer towards Mirnograd. Further west, the Russians have advanced north of Udachne. We have a geolocation here, that they are now in this rail yard directly to the north of it. I'm not 100% sure if they were ever there before. I think there was a strike on a train at this point in the past, but that was the furthest north there was any operation. So this seems to be that the Ukrainians have now entered this, that the Russians have now entered this industrial area here. Towards the west, the Russians have, in the Meshove area, the Russians have operated south of Ivanivka. We have them both in Seleny High as well as in the area directly south of Ivanivka in positions inside of the contested area. We see this here is directly west of Seleny High, and this is here down by the river. So on the map here as well as here, fresh Russian operations are being observed. In the Pokrovsky area, the Ukrainians have taken control of Yanvarske. We have that geolocated here. They took prisoners as well. So Jan Vasquez seems to be back under Ukrainian control, or at least it was temporarily. And the Russians have operated further in the direction of Novoryhorivka here, also geolocated at this point, which indicates that the town was more or less, the Russians were operating more or less all over town. It's probably too early to claim that they took Novoryhorivka and have it fully under control, but that the Ukrainian presence inside is now only limited is probably correct. Further south in the Huliapole direction, the Russians have advanced in the direction of Novovasilivske. This is up here. We have that geolocated as well at this point, that the Russians have reached the eastern part of Novovasilivke, and the deep state map has more or less given several areas here, several border areas over to the Russians, indicating that the Russians had quite some success roughly along this line here in the western direction of the past few days. That was it with territorial changes. If we summarize it, the Russians had their biggest success along this line recently. Ukrainian counterattacks are happening a little bit further north and are showing some successes, but no successes that change the overall situation. North of Udachne, with the Russians reaching that industrial area here, the possessions of the Ukrainians get even more complicated. This is the main line of supply for the Ukrainians, and obviously if the Russians can reach it, that would be a disaster, and every step in this direction brings the Russian closer. So while this is not meaning that now no supply can flow anymore, it makes it easier for the Russians to reach it, and it also makes it easier for the Russians to reach it with drones. So every meter there is a problem. That the Ukrainians are being pushed back east of Mirnograd is probably to be expected. For the Ukrainians, delaying actions there seems to be smarter, but it also shows that the Russians are keeping up the pressure towards Pokrovsk and Mirnograd and are slowly but steadily advancing. Kostiantynivka is being reached from the southeast and the east. Here also Rubicon is active and attacking the Ukrainian supply lines, which will cause additional problems. And this is the next thing we have from Kramatorsk. Here in Kramatorsk, the first fiber optic drone usage was recorded. It hit 200 meters next to the main road towards Kostiantynivka, the road you see in yellow here. So it can now basically be reached by Russian fiber optic drones. This means that we should expect increasing logistical problems in Kostiantynivka as if they hadn't been big enough. This also means that in the midterm, probably Kostiantynivka will have to be abandoned, will be lost to the Ukrainians. Further north in Liman, for the moment, it seems to be stabilized, but in Siversk, the Russians are getting closer from every direction. The end game for Siversk seems to be in the process of starting. It's only a matter of time until the Russians gain a foothold in Siversk itself. At least that's what it seems right now. Liman is set for the moment stabilized, and Kupiansk now under pressure logistically as well. How long the Ukrainians will be able to keep up the bridgehead on the eastern side will have to be seen, but with the Russians slowly grinding forward in Kupiansk, this will be threatened here. The Ukrainian project published data that were supposedly leaked about Russian losses in 2025. Here, supposedly leaked. Now, they can make this themselves. The Ukrainian military intelligence can create those data itself. I have no way of seeing whether these are true except putting them in some context. First of all, they say 281,555 men were lost between January and August 2025. Among those are 86,744 KIA, as well as 33,996 MIA. Interesting is that the ratio of KIA and MIA is 1 to 1.3 to the wounded, so almost equally as many wounded as KIA and MIA, which are mostly killed as well. This is likely due to the drone problematic that due to the problems that the Russians have with drones. I saw at another point from the Russian side where a Russian reporter mentioned that now the Russian IFACs, the Russian individual medical packs that every soldier carries with himself, now have antibiotics as well. Now, antibiotics are usually not needed if you get shot. at least not in the field, because if you get shot, you get evacuated and then get treated. And if you then need antibiotics, you take them. But this is a sign that the Russians understand that the majority of wounded will not be evacuated anytime soon. We need to understand that there's kilometers of gray zone, of contested area. If somebody gets wounded in there, he has to crawl out by himself, or he has to hope that at some point the front line moves to a way that he can be evacuated. But nobody is going to come for him, risk his life to evacuate him. So the losses are high, and wounded personnel has to basically survive on its own. In these areas, obviously, there is no evacuation of the wounded either. So injuries can fester, can create problems, and thus taking antibiotics is now the result of it, because the Russians expect that somebody being wounded is not going to be evacuated anytime soon. This also would then explain why the number of permanent losses to wounded is so extraordinarily high. Usually the rule of thumb is 1 to 3. Here it's 1 to 1.3. Interesting is that the loss ratio published by this data is more or less close to what the Russians say they recruited in new numbers. So that in this regard, it's absolutely realistic. And it's just 5% lower than the data that General Syrski has published. This means that it can be right, but this also means that it can be published to give more credence to Syrski's numbers, even though the Russian losses are high. That is confirmed. So those numbers seem to at least be realistic. If we take these numbers though and adjust them and calculate with the current effective combat strength of the Russian brigades, which is more or less at 2,000 to 2,500 men, this means that the Russians have lost in 2025 alone the equivalent of up to 140 brigades. 140 brigades in 2025 alone. If we move this to the European NATO members, the Russians have lost more men than most of the European armed forces have in total. And this is just their losses in 2025. Then we have more in regards to sabotage, partisans, etc., hybrid warfare. The partisans have blown up train tracks in Leningrad with damage. This was reported by the Ukrainian military intelligence. Then we have the SVR, the Russian Foreign Intelligence Agency. They are claiming the United Kingdom wants to create a false flag attack on a Ukrainian ship or a civilian ship of another nation in a European harbor. The attack would be done by Russians that are fighting for Ukraine, and they would also use Chinese material to implicate the People's Republic of China as a supporter of this. This claim is being published after other claims of coming false flag attacks by the Ukrainians, but it's also happening in the context of a massively increased hybrid warfare that is done by the Russians. Russia is basically preparing for escalation domestically and inside of NATO territories. We talked about it in the past. This hybrid warfare is meant to frighten the Western nations, to show them the danger they are in, and hopefully to make them give up the support for Ukraine, to stop, in quotation mark, provoking the Russians. But it's a sign of aggression that the Russians are presenting here, but it's also a sign that they are unhappy with their successes inside of Ukraine. They would have no need to do this if they expected victory to be actually close. The spotting of drones is also continuing, and the Kremlin is continuing to claim they have nothing to do with this. Interesting is though what Medvedev published. He says he mentions a few options where it could come from. And in the end, he says it doesn't matter where it's from. It's about to give the Europeans a taste what danger actually means. So he basically says it's about frightening them, even though he also basically says it's more likely that it's a false flag operation, either by Europeans to justify military expenditure or by the Ukrainians to draw the Europeans in or force the Europeans to aid more, because this shows how dangerous Russia is. I said it in the past that Russia's operations, for instance, the drones that were flying into Poland, is actually creating the opposite, because if Poland and now Denmark are working on counter-drone capabilities, this means that the equipment that is going to be used for this cannot go to Ukraine, and thus is actually weakening Ukraine. And this is likely one of the goals that Russia has with this operation too. And as said, in the past, the German chancellor said, according to him, the most likely culprit of all of this is Russia. And that was it for today's SITREP. If you liked it, please give it a thumbs up. It helps with the algorithm. If you're new here, I would like to invite you to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon. If you have something to add, use the comment section. This channel is only possible because of the support of viewers like you. If you'd like to support the channel, you can do so by the means in the description. But that's it from me for now. Thank you for watching, and I'll be back.